Today, I think, is one of those, conceptually this is an important day. It kind of gets to what I think is ultimately the big challenge in discussions between people who believe in God and those who say they don't believe in God. And it's a complication of viewing the world. That is, that we look at life in two very different ways. All of us do. That is, within ourselves, we have two very different experiences of life. Lewis says this. Who can quickly tell us the story of the Toolshed?
He's working in the Toolshed and he sees a beam of light coming down through some broken rafters in the roof. And he looks at it from the side angle, and then he contrasts how different it is to look at the beam itself, and then to go and step in it and look kind of through the beam. And so the whole story is just contrasting how things kind of have a looking at it side and then a looking through it, looking along it.
Inside this darkened tool shed, if someone were to stand outside the beam, looking at Lewis as Lewis looked along the beam, and each of them are in the same place, in principle, both describing the beam of light, right? But they'll have very, very different experiences. Lewis will say as he looks along the beam, what? What does he see?
The trees.
Tree, blue sky, way off in the distance, sun. And I say, you are nuts. There are no such things in this tool shed. And the two visions seem completely at odds with one another, and he and I could argue and argue and argue back and forth. And how would we ever solve the problem? I mean, how would we ever come to any kind of resolution? Switching places might help, right? It is, both of us actually can step into the other person's place and say, oh, it isn't so much you, is it? Okay, so if our clickers were working, we would do the next slide, which says, which offers the truer account of mathematical reasoning? The mathematician's perception of the problem? Some people. The neurologist's perception of the mathematician's brain at work. I mean, both are telling something about human mathematical reasoning, aren't they? The one from the inside, the other from the outside. The one looking at the beam, the other looking along the beam. What if we were talking about religious thinking here instead of mathematical thinking? The religious person says, I have a certain view of God. The neurologist says, I can actually trace the neurochemical things going on in your brain. And they can actually get into a debate that where one seems to say, well, no, mine is true, and the other says, no, mine is true. Do you get that arguing like this is sort of trains passing in the night, sort of people on different tracks? They can never collide with one another because they're actually talking about different kinds of things, the different kinds of questions. You observe a shocking injustice. Somebody just taking a brick to a sixth grader. Which offers the truest account of that injustice? Your response that says, that's awful. A philosophical definition of injustice? An anthropological explanation of how in different cultures people define different kinds of things as injustice? The explanation that actually there are certain neurochemical responses that occur in your brain that cause you to feel that as a painful experience? The explanation that those of distant human ancestors who had this particular mutation that experienced pain at the bricking of children, that those individual mutants had a greater survival advantage than those who enjoyed bricking children. Does one tell a lie and the other tell truths? This one is really in question, frankly. That is, if you're going to say, no, the perception that I get when I say, that is unjust and evil. Okay. Now, what do you mean by that? If you're saying it's really unjust and evil, then is there real injustice and real evil?
Yeah, I was thinking about it. The question does seem misleading, and I was like thinking about it. I was thinking of it like as like a building, and I was thinking of like the overall perception is like the and like all of human existence is like all these the three bottom factors have factored in, but overall your end perception is the culmination of all that. And I know that you could say that like the biological explanation would be like the foundation of it, would be like the supports for it, but saying that it's more truer than that the base of it is the most important, therefore the overall is inconsequential to the whole thing, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
We all know that the base does matter, that these mechanics do matter, because we happen to live in a scientific age that takes these things seriously. And where we started was, I was trying to say that I think that I, at any rate, as somebody who believes seriously that right and wrong means something, I at least find that in my own mind, and sometimes in conversation with other people, I'm compelled to defend the view that this means something, that this communicates anything of worth. Whereas I'm very rarely called on to justify that these things communicate anything of any worth. I really think it's, one of these generations, yours, your kids, your grandkids, modern civilization is going to go over a cliff for a while. We're going to have some real tough times. People are going to have to decide whether this means anything or not, whether it's serious and has primacy over stuff like this.
For me, like the least important thing would be the neurological explanation for why you feel that way, because the neurological explanation of what you're feeling, why these chemicals are going through your head is merely a response to having the intellectual and the biological experience. The first thing you're going to have, because most of those are going to go in some form of order, some form of steps. The first, you're going to have this reaction. This isn't good for society. And then you're going to have this neurochemical release, which is a result of having this biological response.
I think that response is going to happen no matter what, and your culture predicts what you define that response to be. You have a response, a physical response, and you put a label on it. If your culture says the label is that's offensive, this is wrong, this is unjust, that's the label you put on that response. If your culture gives it a different label, it's the same physical response, you just put a different label on it.
Well, I think it's also important to determine what kind of perception we're going to call this, because there's going to be a biological perception of it. There's going to be anthropological perception through your cultural and your cultural conditioning. And I think it's important to separate cultural conditioning from rational and philosophical truths about, or some moral claim that you can make about that, because there are plenty of cultural conditionings that you can really make no moral claim about.
Over and over though, all that's being done is defining the first option by the rest. What you were saying was, well sure, the response is important and valid, but only because the rest of these support it.
The other night in the debate, when Shermer said, why can't we just do what's right because it's right? And like questioners got up and said, could you tell us what you mean by right? Do you think that there's a real right and wrong? And Sherman was like, yeah, sure. And how that could be a moral right. I understand mathematical rights and wrong. Well, I understand how there could be a moral right and wrong in a survival of the fittest explanation. You have to mean something like conduces to survival. But that's clearly not what we mean. Clearly.
This question of why does it matter? So long as everything's comfortable and easy, it probably doesn't matter. If we go back 3 generations to the most civilized people in the world, the best educated people in the world, the Germans in the 1930s, and under certain pressures, somehow or another, something inside them collapsed, and they did terrible, terrible, terrible things. That's historic fact. It is a real way that human nature can work, and there are certain, and each of us, I think, history of ideas, what it means to be human. And for myself at any rate, to think through the, to contemplate the possibility that I or my family or we would somehow lose whatever it took, whatever the necessary props were to make us say, I don't give a shit, you can shoot me if you want to, but I stand against that. If we lose that, if we lose whatever it takes to say that, we've lost something important, and that's what's